Greetings, everyone. If you're watching this, that means that you've selected the video direct instruction piece for this week. Before we begin, I just wanted to check in and see how you guys are doing. Hope you guys are staying productive. You're not driving your parents crazy. Parents aren't driving you crazy. And I don't know, it's an interesting time. There's everything is slowed down so much. I'm sure you guys have noticed I imagine you have less schoolwork to do. Um, it creates this opportunity to be of service to your community, but also to pick up weird hobbies and get stuff done. I started reading for pleasure again. I'm reading Florida by Lauren Groff, which is fantastic. And I've been building a lot of chairs on my back deck, rain or shine, and me and my cat sit out there. It's pretty fun. But yeah, email me if you guys are up to anything cool or are looking for volunteer positions in your community. I'm working through getting signed up with the American Red Cross to help distribute meals to those who are needing that. But without any further ado, let's dive right into the Treaty of Versailles, the first step towards a new war. And before we get to the treaty, I really want to talk about and set the stage with where the world leaders were at when they came to Paris to start trying to negotiate a peace. So after 5 years of total war, Axis countries dropping out of the battle, Germany is forced to seek an armistice. Remember, we talked about World War I as a war of attrition with insane numbers. Attrition is when, a war of attrition is a war down to the last man, and that man wins, right? And Germany was just running out of numbers. And they were really unwilling to accept defeat. And one of the big things that actually helped them over to seek an armistice was that they entered into this idea of peace without victory. This was outlined in the 14 points by Wilson, which we'll talk about soon. So the idea of peace without victory means that you're not accepting defeat. You're just saying we're done. And so also Germany is accepting defeat, but this is a war on a global scale that's shifting the course of nations. Empires that had existed for long periods of time dissolved, two of them being the Ottoman Empire and another being the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Um, you know, Russia saw a major revolution and became a communist country. And so, in addition to revolutions, we see the map of Europe and indeed the world and the area we now recognize as the Middle East too, opening up, and boundaries need to be drawn. And so there's a lot that has to happen during these peace talks in Paris. And the hardest hit Allied nations wanted something other than the idea of peace without victory, as they clearly showed over the peace talks in Paris. They actually wanted retribution in the form of economic punishment to strip Germany of the ability to defend itself, and they wanted new territory. There's a lot of progressive stuff that happens that we're going to talk about in this that falls short of its idea and comes closer to more of dividing the spoils of war. So here we can see this map. We see Germany, or a map of Europe during World War I. We see how large Germany is. You see Austria-Hungary. And then after, look at all this new land. Russia loses, and Germany loses their partitioning of Poland. So Poland becomes a country again. East Prussia is new. Latvia is new. We can see where the Austro-Hungarian Empire was. It's broken down into more ethnic states. So big, big changes. And, they have to figure out how these countries are going to represent themselves. And all powers weren't really interested in the kind of secret backroom trade alliances that had existed at the beginning of the war, right? And really caused the war itself. But there's three men who had enormous sway in the procession of peace talks in Paris. The first, and they were the leaders of the three major Allied powers in World War I. And that's a typical thing. To the victor go the spoils, right? If you win a conflict, of course you have the most control over the resolution of that conflict, right? So the three most powerful men were Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau of France, Prime Minister Lloyd George of England, and President Wilson of the United States. So these three men all had vested interest in the idea that they were resolving the war to end all wars, the Great War, as it's still sometimes referred to, the end of this huge conflict. So what they want to do is they want to figure out how to not have it happen again. They really do want it to be the war to end all wars. But George and Clemenceau are also equally interested in holding Germany responsible for their actions with punitive measures. President Wilson, on the other hand, well, he had another idea. And here we arrive at Wilson and his 14 points, which we talked about a minute ago. But let's talk about how when Wilson arrived in Paris at the beginning of the peace talks, he was welcomed as a hero. He was revered. Throngs of crowds, both soldiers and civilian alike, rushed to the streets of Paris, and he rode through the city in a convertible, and they all cheered. There's video of it. So he's seen as this savior figure. And I think Wilson probably thought more than the idea that he ended the conflict was the reason for his popularity. I think Wilson kind of believed that people were on board with his progressive idea. And he had this plan called the 14 Points, which was liberal and progressive. And thinking back to the idea of progressivism and what constitutes a progressive move that we talked about back in the good old days when we were still together in school. Remember, a progressive move is a political act that seeks to improve the moral fabric of a society, to make a better and more just society. And Wilson here is taking the progressive movement of the United States and he's trying to apply it on the world stage in international politics. This is a big reach for Wilson, and he believes he can do it. He puts his whole life into it, so much so that upon returning to the United States, he suffers a serious stroke and his life ends shortly after. Some of the provisions of the 14 Points include the removal of economic barriers, the creation of a world organization called the League of Nations, the predecessor to what we think of now as the United Nations, and a reduction of armaments of all nations. These are big global agreements that he's trying to have reached. Some other stuff he talks about includes free maritime waters and all this other really great stuff. And so people know about this high-minded rhetoric that he has, and leaders of colonial holdings, developing nations, and interested parties flock to Paris for a piece of this, right? Ho Chi Minh, the future leader of the Vietnam resistance, a war that the United States, of course, would be involved with 40, 50 years later, came and pledged the idea of Vietnamese independence. Leaders of the region we now know as the Middle East were coming out and saying, all right, maybe we can have a shot here too. And so there's all of this idea. Japan actually enters in the idea to a racial equality section of the Articles of the League of Nations. It gets rejected, but this is the big picture world progressive stuff that we're talking about. Of course, the follow through, it's a little different. So one of the first tasks in front of the Allies was deciding what to do with the imperial holdings of the defeated powers, and also how to redraw those boundaries. Remember, we just looked at the Austro-Hungarian Empire, big swaths of nations, big countries being created from out of nothing. And the solution arrived at by the Allies is featured in Article 22 of the Treaty of Versailles. It's this thing called a system of mandate. So each nation deemed unfit to rule itself ceded control to a nation that would govern it until it was fit to rule itself. It's kind of like a paternalistic idea, right? So they're we believe that you can practice self-determination, right? The ability to determine your own fate, but you're not ready. So until you're ready, we're going to help you. And there's two types of mandates. So there's Class A mandates, which had to deal with the lands that were formerly the Ottoman Empire, the current Middle East. And a big interest there is oil, right? So we have Iraq, we have Syria, we have these countries that in a lot of ways are still being hurt by the way the mandate system at the Treaty of Versailles went down. And the Class B mandates actually deal with the colonial holdings of Germany. So they're taking away Germany's main ability to make profit for itself. Remember, we talked about imperialism, for better or for worse, last week being the main way that a global power actually earned a lot of income during this time period. And they, as a matter of fact, are taking that from Germany in this treaty. And as we're going to see, that's really only the beginning of the punitive measures towards Germany. So we talked about the economics, right? But that's not really all the economics. There's a series of articles designed inside of the Treaty of Versailles that are specifically made to limit Germany's power in the future. And a lot of these cross the line from being about, preventing Germany from ever rising and trying to take over France again to punishing Germany. So they saw its borders shrink. They lost control of Alsace-Lorraine, which was one of the original things that had sort of happened at the beginning of World War One. But they also lost control of an area mainly German-speaking called the Rhineland to France. Articles 159 and 160 of the Treaty of Versailles placed harsh restrictions on the military power of Germany. They could only have like one battleship, so very small navy, and they could have an army no larger than 100,000. And when we think about the kind of numbers that were at play in nations defending themselves in World War One, where you have millions of people engaged on either side of the battle, 100,000 really doesn't even give Germany the ability to defend itself. So they're taking away German ability to defend their country because they lost this war, which is a huge deal. And Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles forced the Germans to accept all responsibility for damages incurred by the Allies during the war. So blown up buildings, lost lives, weapons. And not only are they forced to accept responsibility, but the Treaty of Versailles sticks this huge bill on Germany in the form of war reparations that got suspended after the economic crash in the late 20s, which we'll talk about soon. But really, the idea that economically Germany is crippled, and especially they even mention it in the treaty that to say in layman's terms, they're like, we know that we've taken your ability to make money from you, but we still expect you to pay us because you're responsible for this. And, that's so like we've taken Germany's ability to defend itself and we've placed them in crippling debt, and we've taken their colonial holdings, and that's, and they've also lost some of their German-speaking their borders are shrinking, right? So these are really harsh measures. And finally, the German side signed the Allies' twist the knife. So actually, the Germans arrived in Paris with the idea that they were accepting peace without victory, right? Like we talked about. But actually, it's probably more akin to a crushing defeat. German leaders were given the Treaty of Versailles. They arrived after most of the talks had happened, so they weren't even really included in the talks. And they were given the treaty with 24 hours to sign it or face invasion. So, of course, they did. In addition to being forced to accept the terms, the Germans weren't given a chance to join the League of Nations, a measure that, if you think about it, really defeats the purpose of the League of Nations itself, right? Like, how are you going to solve global conflict if you're not even giving people a chance to be a part of the group that solves conflicts? It doesn't make sense. The Germans signed the Treaty of Versailles in the Hall of Mirrors on the 5-year anniversary of Franz Ferdinand's assassination in front of maimed French soldiers. So truly, they're saying the Hall of Mirrors was where Germany was created 80 years prior. The 5-year anniversary was of Franz Ferdinand, the event that sparked World War One, and in front of maimed French soldiers. So like, every aspect of this is about humiliating the Germans. And there you have it. All of this will foment and lead rise to nationalism that really causes World War II. And so there you have it. Thanks for watching. I miss you guys.